observer. My name is Tania Cooper Patriota, and I'm here today to speak about the Colombian Peace Process and my experience with the UN mission in Colombia.
Thank you, Ms. Tania, for coming here. Could you tell us a little bit about your career and how you ended up working for the UN?
Okay, so I am originally a psychologist. I also studied public health and international law. I have worked first as a psychologist. I also worked as a researcher for the University of Geneva. And later on, I went to work for the UN after the Agency for Brazilian Cooperation invited me to join a study they were doing on the United Nations on one of the agencies that had decided to install its offices, the UNFPA. And I worked for UNFPA for many years, 25 years in all. This is a development agency. I worked for them in several countries, including Haiti, Colombia, Mongolia, New York, and Geneva. I also then joined the UN mission on the peace process, and this was for another department in the UN, the Department of Political Affairs. That was the most recent of my employment in the United Nations. So this is what we're going to talk about today.
Can you tell us a little bit about how the peace process was implemented? Was it according to the plans outlined in the peace agreement document?
So you will remember that the peace agreement document is now 2 years old. It was signed in November 2016. Before that, there were other phases. The first was the installation of the negotiation table, which was in 2012, when the negotiating parties set up a roadmap for the agreement. That more or less took about a year. And in 2012, at the end of 2012 into 2016, the agreement was actually elaborated. And this agreement was signed, as I mentioned, in 2016, and it has been followed very closely. In particular, the chapter on the end of conflict. You'll remember that there are several sections in this agreement, one of them on rural reform, another one on victims, another one on justice, another one on illegal drugs, etc. So the one we are focusing on in the mission that was established in Colombia in 2016, is the end of conflict, and that covers disarmament and also reintegration. And in particular, the UN is responsible for was responsible, because that's already finished, the mechanism for the monitoring and verification of the implementation of the agreement in terms of disarmament, complete disarmament of the guerrilla. So this has gone according to plan, exactly according to plan, except for the timeline. The disarmament process took maybe a couple of months longer than had been planned. It had been planned for 180 days, and it was longer than that. And the reason for that was the conditions of the terrain, the roads, and the very, very precarious locations where the FARC guerrilla were regrouped into 27, originally 28, then it became 26 locations for disarmament and reintegration throughout the country, but these were in remote locations. So it hadn't been planned that the infrastructure for the habitats for these groups would take so long to be ready. However, the disarmament took place nevertheless. They still lived in tents in many places, but they did lay down their arms in time for the completion, which was in August 2017. What did not go according to plan exactly was the reintegration process. That has taken much longer than had been anticipated. And that's due to various reasons.
And can you tell us a little bit more about this reintegration process and how it happened?
Yes, the reintegration depends on several conditions. It rests upon several conditions. One of them is the accreditation of each of the individual guerrilla members. That is, there has to be proof that their weapons have been given in, have been laid down, then that their identity has been clarified. Many of them had more than one name because they were hiding from the authorities. So it took a long time to establish their identity. The next step, once their identity is established, is to open a bank account. The bank account allowed them to receive a subsidy that the government was and still does send to them to their bank account, so that they can set up an initiative, an economic initiative, or a productive project. Mainly agricultural projects, but in order to become independent, they need to receive this subsidy. So this is all part of the reintegration process. This is part of the economic and legal reintegration. That's summarizing the process, because there are also some training that has to take place. In many cases, the FARC members did not have a literacy that was sufficient for them to be trained in all kinds of different tasks or jobs that they wanted to get into, and some of them as bodyguards, some of them as drivers, some of them as had other ambitions, and for that they needed to have literacy courses because many of them had not gone to school. So this was also part of their reintegration.
Can you tell us a little bit about the enterprise, the micro-enterprise that were established, and did the UN help them to develop these initiatives?
We can distinguish several types of enterprises or initiatives that the FARC members, once they were disarmed, were involved in. Collective and individual income generation projects. So important to mention is that the collective and individual projects have to be approved by the National Reintegration Committee through a technical clearance process. Once they are approved technically, then they can receive some funding from the government so that they can set up their micro-enterprises. Since the last report of the mission, of the UN mission, where there is an update on this type of project, there are about 20 approved collective projects. Most of them are agricultural projects in the regions where they were disarmed and where they settled once they were moved from their original positions. In 2016, they settled in these territories for reintegration and training, and in the surrounding areas, they were able, most of them, not all of them, to purchase land or to be granted land so that they could set up these productive agricultural projects of all kinds of growing vegetables or setting up a cattle farm or all types of projects, bakery or tailor, setting up shops for selling clothes and making their own clothes and selling their clothes and so on. There are all kinds of different projects, but mainly they're agricultural. And there are about 30 individual projects that were approved. And together, these projects are valued at approximately $3.7 million. This is the last report we have. And these would benefit about 1,300 former combatants, including 400 women. So to date, funds were disbursed for 7 of the collective projects and for about 30 individual projects. So independently of these projects, which receive funding from the government, from this National Reintegration Council, there are also projects that have been supported by the UN. And these are about 290 different projects that the UN mission has been able to identify in 23 different areas. About 190 are self-funded, and they're agricultural crops, fisheries, cattle, textile, wood transformation, trade, and ecotourism. As an example, there's some FARC ex-combatants who have become now tourist guides and rafters. They were trained to take tourists down the rapids. This is something quite new. They underwent several weeks of training. So if they can generate enough trust in the tourism industry, they would be working in this field of tourism. So this is something that they themselves had mentioned they could do because they know the terrain so well. So now maybe the challenge is to engage enough visitors and to build trust and confidence in this new life and this new role that they would have now in society. There is also collaboration on the part of the private sector in these different initiatives. There are private sector foundations and businesses that are contributing to these activities. In one location that I've read about, because there's been much reporting about it, it's Llano Grande in the Department of Antioquia. There are 14 private sector foundations that are supporting investments in business startups, apprenticeship. They're being helped, and the UN has a fund, a trust fund called the Post-Conflict Multi-Partner Fund, where they pool funding from different donors, including from countries that are interested in supporting donor countries that are interested in supporting these projects. So these projects are mainly again agricultural, and the funding goes through the UNDP, the United Nations Development Program, and the International Organization for Migration. Those are the main UN agencies that are supporting technically these projects. But there are also there's an interesting project that is that the production, the vegetables and the crops that are gathered from these different initiatives are also bought by the World Food Program, and they're used to be sold to the school feeding program. You see, they sell these products to the World Food Program, who in turn use them for school feeding. So it's something, an interesting way to support and to let's say to foster this type of distribution of these crops, because you have to remember that many communities are not very sympathetic to the FARC because they remember them as a guerrilla group. So this confidence has to be built over time, and one of the ways is with the support of these UN agencies. So this, to answer your question, has the UN supported? Yes. And there is also a peace-building fund. This is a separate fund, UN fund, that has its headquarters at the Secretariat of the UN in New York. And they also have approved some funding, $3 million for different reintegration programs. So there is quite a lot of support from the UN, not only technically, but also in terms of coordination of different donor contributions. And we've also helped to bring donors and private sector companies closer to the communities where these FARC members live, so that they can visit these projects and see for themselves if this is, if it's worth contributing. Yeah. But in general, there's been, a positive response from those donors.
So we know that the FARC became a political party after the process, and the National Liberation Army, the ELN, became then the largest rebel group in Colombia. And after the peace agreement with the FARC, the ELN and the government started the peace talks, negotiations, but the conflicts are still ongoing, as we saw on January 17th with the attack at the police academy in Bogota. Therefore, what are the prospects for a potential peace agreement in this environment?
So this is a very important question, but it's also a very difficult question, because at this point in time, and as you said, there was recently an attack on the police station. There was actually an attack also last year, more or less at the same time, also against a police station, but with less victims. So this is a recurring phenomenon in the ELN, is that they do not respect, they announce a ceasefire, but then they don't respect the ceasefire, the unilateral ceasefire, not a bilateral, not a there hasn't been there was initially a bilateral ceasefire. Both parties had agreed to one very, very initially when they started the talks in 2016, but it didn't last very long. So what I would like to say about this, even though it's very unlikely that they will resume talks, the Secretary General of the UN has insisted that communication channels should remain open. No matter how far we are now from how far apart the two parties are. They've never been so far apart since the very beginning of the talks in 2016, the ELN and the government. You'll remember that the UN also supported the verification of the cessation of hostilities during 2017 when the ELN had claimed that they would stop all attacks. These attacks continue to take place. Maybe an element that we should remember is that when the talks were interrupted in the middle of last year, there were 6 cycles of talks between the government and the ELN. When the last time they were interrupted, both sides had made demands on the other, but neither one accepted those demands. On the side of the ELN, it was that they wanted a bilateral ceasefire to hold. That was their condition to continue the talks. And the government had asked that the ELN release all the hostages and that they would stop all the kidnapping and they stop all the hostilities. So neither one agreed to these conditions. Now the current president has demanded after this attack that Cuba, where the ELN negotiating team is living, capture the negotiating team and return it return the members of this team to the Colombian authorities so that they can be judged. Cuba has not done this yet because they claim that there is a protocol that was signed by the guarantor countries and by the two parties in 2016. And according to this protocol, if there's an interruption in the talks, then there is a protocol to be followed, which is to return the negotiating team, but not to the authorities. They have to be returned and set free in the country, or rather just return them, but not capture them and force them to be held by the authorities, you see. So there's a legal controversy going on right now. So the ELN have acknowledged responsibility for the attack, and there is a very strong international consensus that this is a terrorist attack, and that the ELN should be condemned, and in the strongest possible terms. There should be they should bring the perpetrators of this attack to justice, and there should be compliance with international law and cooperation with the government of Colombia. So the Security Council has expressed. So this is a very strong consensus. So it's very probable that the negotiation team will be returned to Colombia. We don't know in what form this will happen, exactly how and when exactly it will happen, but the president has insisted that they must be brought to justice. So this brings us further away from any negotiation, because there's a breakdown now in the dialogue. So it's very improbable that the negotiations will continue in the short term. But it's also very improbable that a military solution will be the solution to this conflict with the ELN. So there's very little more we can say right now, but it's not a it does not look very promising right now in terms of peace with the ELN.
Thank you so much for coming.
You're welcome.
It's great to have you here.
Thank you.
Hope you can come back another day and we can talk a little bit more.
Thank you so much for your